This is the Reasonable Faith Podcast with Dr. William Lane Craig. Welcome. I'm Kevin Harris. Two big debates occurred recently. Dr. Craig has promised today we're going to talk about the Lawrence Krauss debate. Lawrence Krauss is respected in academia, and he's also somewhat of a popularizer. How is he influential? What are some of his main things that he's known for?
Well, in the academic world, he's a very prominent particle physicist, a specialist in the subatomic realm of physics. And he has recently moved out to Arizona State University, where he's now the head of a sort of think tank or foundation that explores origins questions of various sorts. Unfortunately, over the years, Lawrence Krauss has become increasingly bitter and vitriolic in his public critiques of religion. He has become a regular contributor to popular magazines and newspapers in which he inveighs against religious belief and seems to champion a sort of scientism that thinks that science has all the answers to the really important questions, and that if a question doesn't have a scientific answer, then it's really not a question worth asking. And so he's become a very popular figure on the internet and YouTube and through his popular books on science, and I think an outspoken critic of religious belief in general.
What is his view on the Big Bang? There's a popular YouTube video of getting something from nothing.
Exactly. That's what he claims. He says that the universe came into being or was created out of nothing. And he has a book that is coming out this next year. I saw the proofs of the book on the table at the debate. He had it with him, called Creation Out of Nothing. And he claims that science can explain how the universe came into being from nothing without any recourse to a creator. His line here is very much like the line taken by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow in their new book, The Grand Design. And therefore, he says, this answers, and I quote, crazy question that religious people are always asking: why is there something rather than nothing? He thinks that age-old question has now been answered by science.
In preparation for this debate, how did you prepare? What areas did you bone up on?
Well, I knew that his areas of specialization would be physics, and that therefore I needed to be very much up to speed on the physics of contemporary cosmology and the origin of the universe, and then also on the fine-tuning of the universe. And so I conferred with people like James Sinclair, who's a physicist and my colleague, wrote the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology article with me on current work on the origins of the universe, and then consulted with Robin Collins, a philosopher of science, who is probably, I think, the world's leading expert in the fine-tuning argument. In addition to that, I consulted with Tim McGrew of Western Michigan University with regard to certain issues in probability theory that seemed to me to be very crucial to the debate topic, because the topic of the debate, Kevin, was not, does God exist? And there seemed to be some misunderstanding about that. That wasn't the debate topic. The debate topic was, is there evidence for God? And that's a quite different question than, does God exist? Imagine in a court of law, if you were to ask, is there evidence that the accused is guilty? Well, of course, there's some evidence, otherwise it wouldn't be in court. But that doesn't mean that he is guilty. The defense might offer a case that is so compelling and so overwhelming that it would give grounds for thinking that the prosecution has not carried the burden of proof. But that wouldn't show that there is no evidence for the accused's guilt. Well, similarly here, to say that there's evidence for God is making a very weak claim. All it is saying is that the existence of God is more probable given certain facts than it would have been in the absence of those facts. That's all that is to say. It's not to say that God's existence is more probable than not, or that God exists. It just is to say that God's existence is more probable given these facts than it would have been if we didn't have those facts. And so I listed, I think, 5 facts that I thought increase the probability of God's existence and therefore constitute evidence for God.
This clears up something that you hear constantly. That is, the new atheist, internet atheist constantly say there's no evidence for God. I mean, isn't that a rather broad statement? Of course there's evidence for God. We wouldn't be talking about it. Atheists and theists for eons have discussed the evidence for God.
Right.
And so that's, if there's rhetoric anywhere, that's very rhetorical. Perhaps they mean there's no good evidence for God, or there's no evidence
or no
that
compelling evidence for God or something. And that would be a legitimate question to raise. And in fact, it's almost irresistible, Kevin, to interpret the topic that Krauss and I were debating in those terms. And I noticed that when the judge, who was the moderator for the debate, introduced the debate, he kept doing this, much to my distress. He kept framing the topic as, is there sufficient evidence for God? Dr. Craig, he said, will be arguing tonight that there is sufficient evidence for God. Dr. Krauss will be arguing that the evidence is insufficient. And I was sitting there in my seat thinking, no, that's not what I'm going to be arguing. That's not the topic for tonight. But of course, you can't speak out and correct the moderator when he's introducing the debate. But it's an almost irresistible temptation to interpret the question that way. But that wasn't the question under debate. And Krauss realized this as well. He said himself clearly in his opening speech, we are not here to debate the existence of God. And that's why he did not present any arguments against God's existence. He had no burden to do that in the debate. All we were there to discuss was, is there evidence for God? Not, is there compelling evidence or is there sufficient evidence to ground belief in God or whatever. So the topic was actually one that I thought was very easy to support from my point of view.
Sure. Krauss agreed, however, to the topic of the debate.
Well, it was his topic, actually, Kevin. The topic that I thought we were going to debate was, has science eliminated the need for God? That is what people like Hawking and Mlodinow have claimed and what Krauss seemed to have claimed. So I thought that would be our topic, has science eliminated the need for God? But he did not want to debate that and came back with the suggestion, is there evidence for God? And I suspect that the reason he wanted that topic was that he thought that put all the burden of proof on me. I would then have to get up and give evidence for God in answer to that question in the affirmative. And I think he was right that that does put the burden of proof on me, but it is a burden that is very, very light, as I've just attempted to explain, and therefore very easy to support.
Was Krauss willing to accept the terms of the debate and declare that there is no evidence for God?
Well, that's logically what he would have to maintain, which is itself a rather radical proposition. How would you support the view that there is no evidence for God? And he didn't really attempt to do that.
In fact, he seems to be affirmative on some things for God. I mean, he doesn't seem to totally rule God out.
Oh, well, that kind of emerged by the end of the debate, didn't it? And
yes,
that
it
did
did
surprise me a bit. He seemed to be a little bit open to a kind of deism.
You'd never pick it up anywhere else.
No, you wouldn't.
But it did come out in this debate.
Yeah, it did. He did seem to have some openness to deism, which is very significant because it wasn't about the Christian God. That wasn't the debate topic. It was about whether there's evidence for God. And he seemed to be willing to concede, well, I don't know if there's evidence for God, but at least that such a being might exist.
He made a big deal about his T-shirt, that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
I think people had hard time following it.
Yes, it wasn't clearly relevant, and he has since clarified this on his Facebook page, but in a way, I think, that is really damaging to his cause. Let me give you a little background. In his video lectures on YouTube, he wears this T-shirt as a kind of gag. It says 2 + 2 = 5 for very large values of 2. Well, that's just a nonsensical statement. It's meant to be funny. Certain functions, when you plug in very high values for their variables, can have unexpected properties. But 2 isn't a variable. 2 is a value of a variable. So it doesn't make even any sense to say for very large values of 2, because 2 is itself a value. And so it's a nonsensical statement. It's meant to be funny that 2 plus 2 equals 5 for very large values of 2. But the reason he brought it up in our debate was he was springboarding off of a quotation that I gave in my opening speech from Michael Krauss with respect to the moral argument. And I don't know if you remember this, but I was explaining that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But that even someone like Michael Krauss admits in the end that there are objective moral values and duties. And then here comes this quotation that I give from Michael Krauss, where he says, the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 plus 2 equals 5. So what Krauss is saying there is that these moral truths have the same sort of logical necessity that fundamental truths of arithmetic have. And to say that it's morally acceptable to rape little children is as absurd as saying 2 plus 2 equals 5. Well, Krauss, when he heard that, this clicked in his mind because he was wearing his 2 plus 2 equals 5 shirt. And so he says the reason he did this was to show that common sense is often overruled by rigorous science, that what seems commonsensical and true turns out not to be true when you investigate it scientifically. And even 2 plus 2 might equal 5, for very high values of 2. Well, Kevin, if you take that point seriously, what he's suggesting there is that it might well, in fact, be true that it is morally acceptable to rape little children. That's what he's affirming.
He's making a lighthearted joke over an excruciating sentence.
Exactly.
From Michael Krauss.
I don't think he appreciated what he was saying. He was wearing the T-shirt under his coat and tie. He heard me say this example of 2 plus 2 equals 5. And he just sort of thoughtlessly takes that as a springboard for pulling his standard gag in attacking common sense, not realizing that what he is saying there is that Michael Krauss could, in fact, really be mistaken about this. It really might well be acceptable morally for us to rape little girls and rape little boys. That, for example, abuse by Catholic priests is really a morally acceptable thing after all, which I think is just unconscionable. It's just horrific. So if that was the point that he was trying to make with his shirt, I think it really backfires on him.
Now, his opening statements, and when you make an opening statement, usually it's not a rebuttal. It is something you prepared in advance.
Right. Well, to his credit, he did respond to every one of my arguments in some way. And in that sense, this was a good debate. There was clash. I was really surprised at his opening attack upon what he called Aristotelian logic and my use of probability theory. This was really shocking to me because if I, as a Christian, had to defend my worldview by attacking classical logic and probability theory, I would be derided as hopelessly irrational. And yet this seemed to be the line that he was taking. And what I was saying was logically impeccable. I mean, my arguments were logically valid, and moreover, my use of probability theory was flawless. All I was saying is that to say there's evidence for God is to say that the probability of God's existence is greater given certain facts and the background information than it is just on the background information alone. Well, that's how you define the phrase is evidence for in probability theory. And yet he got up and attacked my use of probability, which I thought was amazing. And I think that in his later comments, he kind of backed away from this. I think he was just saying you can't use common sense or something of that sort to argue for these things. You've got to use science. But that's not an effective refutation of my arguments because I did appeal to science and to the best established facts of human experience in a wide range of disciplines. So my arguments aren't at all just sort of appeals to commonsensical notions, though I think they fit with common sense, but I was quite happy to appeal to the best evidence of science and history and philosophy.
One thing that showed me that Dr. Krauss was not as prepared as he should have been, and he knew going in that this was going to be a formidable debate, but he used things that you've straightened out time and time and time again. And all he's got to do is listen to a few podcasts, and we're going to mention extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Oh, yes.
He brought that up for the billionth time. I mean, how many times have you addressed that? How many times have been thrown at you? He
actually mentioned Hume by name, that Hume had shown the identification of miracle as impossible. Showed again, this is a man, though highly trained in his narrow discipline, has no idea that Hume's argument has been exposed as demonstrably fallacious, most recently, for example, by the philosopher of science John Ehrman of the University of Pittsburgh in his book Hume's Abject Failure, which is Ehrman's description of Hume's argument against the identification of miracles. And yet that was Dr. Krauss's main response to the argument from the resurrection of Jesus. It was to appeal to Hume.
And God of the gaps. Talk about trotting out. You're accused of trotting out your 5 points. But these responses I saw as trotting out extraordinary claims, require extraordinary evidence, God of the gaps.
Right. And with respect to the two arguments where I appealed to scientific evidence, namely the cosmological argument from the beginning of the universe and then the teleological argument from the fine-tuning. In both cases, Kevin, my appeal to scientific evidence was not used as evidence for God. Rather, it was evidence for the religiously neutral claims, one, that the universe began to exist, and two, that the best explanation of the fine-tuning is not physical necessity or chance. Now, those are religiously neutral statements of science. And to suggest that scientific evidence cannot establish the truth of those statements is to have some kind of a priori restriction upon the scope of science, which would be extraordinary. So take that religiously neutral statement, the universe began to exist. That's a scientific claim that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics and is certainly open to being established by the evidence. And my claim was that that premise is more probable than not in light of the evidence. And then that premise can serve as one point or premise in an argument to a conclusion which has theological significance. So the scientific evidence was not being used as God of the gaps at all. Similarly, with regard to the fine-tuning argument, Roger Penrose argues against the explanation of the fine-tuning being chance alone, and he does so on scientific grounds. Richard Dawkins argues against the fine-tuning being explained by physical necessity, and he does so on scientific grounds. So to argue that the fine-tuning is not best explained by chance or physical necessity is again to present a purely scientific argument for a purely scientific conclusion. So the allegation that this was God of the gaps reasoning just failed to stick. It was an old canard, as you say, that just gets tossed out for rhetorical effect.
The 3 points of the Kalam cosmological argument lead to further examination and analysis on what would constitute this cause of the universe. You don't derive from that, therefore, the God of Christianity exists.
No, not at all.
There's some other work to be done to reach that conclusion.
Right. You have to do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. That's right. Like the beginning of the universe, to me, it is obvious that the existence of God is more probable given the beginning of the universe than it would have been in the absence of any evidence for the beginning of the universe.
Someone arguing against God has 2 recourses, it seems. 1, the universe is eternal, and so there was no cause. Or 2, there are multiple universes out there, and therefore this universe was bound to happen just in all probability. And so,
yeah, I think that is actually, as I thought about this in advance of the debate, that Dr. Krauss could, if he were thoughtful, have 2 strategies. And I think you just enunciated them. One would be to deny the fact that I'm claiming constitutes evidence. In other words, you would deny that there is a beginning of the universe. You would deny that Jesus rose from the dead. You would deny the fine-tuning of the universe. That would be one way, is you would say these are not facts, and therefore they don't render God's existence more probable. The other way would be to grant that the fact is a fact, but claim that God's existence is no more probable given that fact than it would have been on the background information alone. And you could take either one of those tacks in arguing against me. So take the contingency argument. There, you cannot deny the fact that there are contingent beings because you yourself are a contingent being. So in that case, it's no good to say, well, there are no contingent beings. You're stuck with that. So what Krauss would have to say is the existence of God is no more probable given the existence of contingent beings than it would have been in the absence of contingent beings. That's the way he would need to argue. But he didn't argue that way. He didn't even understand the argument from contingency. And that was evident in that his response was to say, well, contingent things happen all the time. Look at the Japanese earthquake and the tsunami. That was contingent. And I thought, what in the world is he thinking of? Because obviously the earthquake had causes. There are explanations for why the earthquake and the tsunami occurred. So why in the world he thought that was a refutation of the argument from contingency, I just have no idea.
So what tack did he take then? Because he didn't really go to those two options that you mentioned.
Well, I think he did go on some of those options, though without clearly enunciating it. With respect to the contingency argument, I think he simply failed to understand it. He didn't understand what I was arguing because he just said, well, contingent things happen all the time. With respect to the beginning of the universe, there, I think he wanted to argue that the universe just came into being out of nothing. But the difficulty there, Kevin, is that when Dr. Krauss uses the word nothing, he's using it in a non-philosophical sense to mean something like the quantum vacuum. That is to say, empty space filled with vacuum energy. And that's not nothing. That's clearly something. So he's using words in an equivocal way. And the fact that science can explain how the quantum vacuum converted into a material state does nothing to explain why the universe came to exist or how you got something from nothing. It just is talking about how the universe transformed from a quantum state into the observable material universe that we observe today.
Dr. Craig, we are out of time, so we want to continue this in the next podcast and talk a little bit about the after-debate comments that have come out from Dr. Krauss and from people all over the internet. That'll be next time on Reasonable Faith. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Reasonable Faith Podcast with Dr. William Lane Craig. Kevin Harris here along with Dr. Craig as we continue talking about the Lawrence Krauss debate. Two debates, very significant, back-to-back almost, that we're going to be discussing in the next few podcasts. And Bill, I have to say, that must have worn you out to have those two to conduct back-to-back and also do all the prep that goes into these.
It really was exhausting. I was pretty spent after this was over. It was like crossing the mountaintop and then being on the downhill slope afterwards. It was a great relief.
Dr. Krauss has written some post-mortem of his debate. Dr. Craig, today you're going to get an opportunity to respond to some of the things that he has written. And one of the things that you said that you've kind of delayed the response so that cooler heads will prevail.
Yes, I thought that the reaction was very emotional, and there are substantive issues here that need to be talked about. And so I'd like to just put those emotions aside and talk about the questions.
He does open his blog by saying that it sometimes surprises me, he says, quoting, how religious devotees feel the need to regularly reinforce their own convictions in groups of like-minded individuals. I suppose this is the purpose of regular Sunday school services, for example, to reinforce the community of belief in between the rest of the week and so on. Kind of ironic, since he is posting on one of the more popular community atheist sites. And one thing that the internet has allowed people to do is, atheists in particular, is to get together and fellowship, reinforce each other's beliefs, pat each other on the back. And all they have to do now is sing a little bit and have some fried chicken that'd be just like us.
Right. By contrast, this debate was held at a state university. It is precisely in such a public forum that I'm interested in discussing these issues, not on friendly territory or in a church or Christian university, but on a state university campus. So I'm interested in having discussions of these issues in public forums on our best university campuses.
He says something very disturbing on his blog. He says, let me comment now, with the gloves off, on the disingenuous distortions, simplifications, and outright lies that I regarded Craig as having spouted. I was very disappointed because I had heard that Craig was more of a philosopher than a proselytizer, but that was not evident the other evening. First thing that we'll look at, though, is when is there evidence for God? And you brought out a formula.
Right, I did. I gave a formula from the probability calculus for what it means to say that there's evidence for a certain hypothesis. And in probability theory, to say that there's evidence for a certain hypothesis is simply to say that that hypothesis is more probable given certain facts than it would have been in the absence of those facts. And this ought to be uncontroversial, Kevin. This is simply the way the notion is evidence for is defined in probability theory. It's completely unobjectionable.
So then what constitutes evidence and evidence for God? I've often heard it said, those are arguments for God. That's not evidence of God.
Well, I listed 5 facts that I thought render the existence of God more probable than God's existence would have been in the absence of those facts. And those facts would be the existence of contingent beings, the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe for interactive intelligent life, the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world, and then the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. It seemed to me that given these 5 facts, that the existence of God is more probable than it would have been in the absence of those facts. And to me, Kevin, that just seems almost indisputably true. Now, that's not to say that God exists or that it's probable that God exists. It's just to say that God's existence is more probable, given those facts, than it would have been without them. And that is, as I say, unobjectionable and should not be a controversial point in terms of what does it mean to say that there is evidence for a hypothesis.
Dr. Krauss seems to think that you were arguing on the basis of that the probability of God's existence is greater than 50%.
Yes, this is very odd. He complains that I asserted that therefore God's existence is more probable than not, or greater than 50%. And if you look at my opening speech, Kevin, I explicitly said I would not be arguing for that. And I even put up a little formula on the PowerPoint to the effect that God's existence on the evidence and background information is greater than 50%. And I said, I will not be arguing this tonight. I'm going to leave that up to you to decide for yourselves. I'm simply going to argue that God's existence is more probable given these facts than it would have been without them. And therefore, Dr. Krauss's complaint here, I think, is just completely misconceived. He has misconstrued my argument. And so I don't need to consider what he calls the prior probability of God's existence on the background information alone. We don't even need to consider that because we're not asking whether God's existence is more probable than 50%. That's not the subject for the debate that night.
Would that be a good debate topic, you think? Have you seen people put a probability on it?
Well, that would be a good topic for debate, in fact. That would be a topic that would ask the question, does God exist? Or is it probable that God exists? And would be a worthy topic for debate. But this was an unusual topic that Dr. Krauss chose. This topic was simply, is there evidence for God?
He immediately went to God of the Gaps and accused you of God of the Gaps reasoning.
Yes, he accused me of simply saying, because I can't explain something, therefore God must have done it.
Yeah, and I want our listeners to understand, and if they've listened to any of our podcasts, we've addressed this over and over. It's come up in so many debates that I don't understand why Dr. Krauss hasn't heard this addressed.
I think that people like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and others have this as a kind of stock-in-trade response to theistic arguments, and they're not really being attentive to the argument itself. This is just sort of their standard reply, is to make the God of the Gaps accusation. But Kevin, when you look at the arguments that I gave, there were two of them that appealed to scientific evidence. And it's completely incorrect, as I explained in the course of the debate. In the two arguments that I gave that do appeal to scientific evidence, I do not appeal to the evidence as saying, therefore, God explains this or God exists. What I say is that we have good evidence for the premise that the universe began to exist. Now, that's a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. It is certainly a question that is open to scientific evidence. There can be no reason to think that this is a proposition that science could not establish to be true, that the universe began to exist. In my other argument, the fine-tuning argument, I appeal to scientific evidence to show that the best explanation of the fine-tuning is neither chance nor physical necessity. And again, those are purely scientific statements that are open to scientific evidence. Roger Penrose has argued against chance as the best explanation on scientific grounds. Richard Dawkins has argued against physical necessity as the best explanation on purely scientific grounds. So in neither case am I appealing to evidence for God. I'm appealing to evidence to show, in the one case, that the universe began to exist, in the other case, that the fine-tuning of the universe is not plausibly explained by chance or physical necessity. So what I would say is that scientific evidence can establish a premise in an argument which leads to a conclusion which has theological significance. And that is not God of the Gaps reasoning, because the scientific evidence is used purely to establish that religiously neutral premise, like the universe began to exist.
You seem to be arguing then, Bill, from things we do know, not things we don't know.
Yes, I'm saying the scientific evidence supports this proposition, and that proposition then can serve as a premise in a philosophical argument to a conclusion that has theological significance.
You went to the existence of contingent beings next, and how did Krauss handle that?
Well, this is the argument that says, why do contingent beings exist? You need to have a metaphysically necessary being to ground the existence of contingent beings. And Dr. Krauss, I think, even in his post-debate comments, clearly doesn't understand the argument from contingency, because what he says is, well, contingent things happen all the time and they have natural explanations, and there could be a natural explanation of the origin of the universe. Well, merely positing another contingent being, Kevin, to explain the origin of the universe doesn't do anything to answer our question, why are there any contingent beings at all, rather than nothing, or rather than just necessary beings, like, say, mathematical objects. So he's just failed to understand the argument and merely posits another contingent being in existence, which doesn't answer the question, why do contingent beings exist?
Kind of puts the problem back a step?
Exactly. Just moves the problem back a notch. And in the contingency argument, as you know, the argument has nothing to do with the origin of the universe, as Dr. Krauss seems to assume. The universe could be eternal, and yet we could still ask, why does an eternal contingent universe exist rather than nothing, or rather than just mathematical objects? How is it that this eternal universe should exist rather than nothing, or rather than merely necessary beings? So merely positing the eternality of the past of the contingent universe just doesn't go any distance to answering the question, why do contingent beings exist at all?
the beginning of the universe. This should have been a place where Dr. Krauss just really shined.
Right.
I
This
couldn't
should
wait
have
to hear
been
what
in his wheelhouse.
Yeah. Well, in his postmortem responses, he's presenting, coupled with the debate, 3 objections. 1, every physical event has a physical cause.
Mm-hmm. Now, even if that were true, Kevin, notice that doesn't do anything to refute either premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, which says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. It doesn't refute either of those premises, therefore it doesn't refute the argument. It would simply raise the question, when you get to the cause of the universe, could this be a physical cause as opposed to an immaterial cause? And what I would argue is that when you get to a cause of the universe, you have to have a being that transcends space and time in order to bring space and time into existence. And therefore, this cannot be a physical or material cause. So that it is the nature of the case that leads us to infer that the cause we're dealing with here has to be an immaterial or non-physical reality rather than a physical reality, because we're dealing here with the origin of space-time itself.
So what's shown here? A real naturalistic bias of saying it's got to have a natural explanation? Material or physical?
I suppose so. One could simply ask him what warrant is there for thinking that the cause of the universe is physical or even could be physical. As I explained in the debate, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem requires that the physical universe and even the multiverse, if there is such a thing, cannot be extrapolated to past infinity. It had a beginning, and therefore space and time themselves came into being. And so the cause of the universe has to be a being beyond space and time, and therefore non-physical and immaterial.
Have you been able to ascertain what Dr. Krauss thinks of the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem?
No, I haven't, Kevin, and this was a big surprise to me because I had anticipated, since I was using this in my opening speech, that he would attempt to challenge that theorem or perhaps to craft some models of the universe that escaped the theorem and could restore an eternal past, but he didn't try to do that at all.
The ekpyrotic cyclic model of Paul Steinhardt and Neil Turek will avoid the beginning of the universe. In other words, if you want to try to avoid the beginning of the universe, well, this is the model that will do it.
This really surprised me, Kevin, because Dr. Krauss ought to know that the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to the Steinhardt-Turek ekpyrotic cyclic model. It is precisely one of those so-called brain cosmologies that are governed by the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, and therefore even its proponents admit that it cannot be past eternal, but that the universe had a beginning. So I was really surprised that he made this mistake in thinking that somehow this model would restore a past eternal universe in the face of the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem.
In fact, he doesn't himself accept the Steinhardt-Turek.
No, that's true. That's the irony as well. He makes a point of saying, I don't really believe this theory, but here's how you can explain why the universe is finite in the past or infinite in the past. Well, that is very odd to appeal to a false theory to try to restore the past infinity of the universe. But whether he believes in it or not is immaterial in the end because, as I say, it is governed by the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and therefore cannot be past eternal.
In certain quantum gravity models, space and time are created at the moment of the Big Bang itself. Now, that is something that he also said in order to avoid
and
the
I
beginning.
would say exactly. That's exactly right. In, for example, the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal or Vilenkin's quantum tunneling model, these semi-classical quantum gravity models involve an absolute origin of the universe, of space and time, in the finite past. They are not extrapolated to past infinity. And so these models support the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument that the universe began to exist. What they do not do and cannot do is explain how the universe could come into being from non-being, from non-existence.
Now, Dr. Krauss is writing a book about this.
Yes.
Is his book going to be an attempt, as far as you can tell, to avoid a beginning of the universe?
I don't think so. As I understand it, he wants to explain how the universe came into being from nothing, according to science.
In a sense, he believes in a beginning.
I take it that he does, Kevin, because he seems to want to affirm models like the Hartle-Hawking model, for example, that does have an absolute beginning, but he thinks that these will be self-explained, that they'll explain how the universe came into being out of nothing. But what the reader has to watch very carefully is how he uses the word nothing. Because as Dr. Krauss put it in our debate, he says there are different kinds of nothing. That is to say, he's using the word nothing to describe what are, in fact, physical states of affairs, physical realities, like the quantum vacuum or this topological sector in the Hartle-Hawking model out of which our universe emerges. But these are not extrapolable to past infinity. They're not past eternal. And so he really is equivocating on the use of the word nothing here.
Is this the objection that goes something along the lines of, there was no moment prior to the Big Bang because moments came into being, time, space, temporality, and everything?
Yes, that's right.
And so therefore there would be no way for God to create because there would be no moment for the creation?
I don't know that that's what Dr. Krauss would say, but that is something that I've seen in the literature. And it is correct to say on these models, time began to exist. That is to say, there is an interval of time which is absolutely first, before which no time existed. And my own position is that God sans the universe, without the universe, exists timelessly, and that at the moment of creation, he enters into time in order to sustain a causal relationship with the universe, and that the moment of creation is simultaneous with the moment of the universe coming into being.
The fine-tuning of the universe. Dr. Krauss kind of appears to deny the fine-tuning of the universe.
Yes, this represented a shift of ground. In the debate, he tried to explain away the fine-tuning through the many worlds hypothesis, but now he seems to want to deny the fact of fine-tuning altogether.
Well, you gave examples of fine-tuning, like the subatomic weak force, cosmological constant, the low entropy condition of the early universe. Well, Dr. Krauss, what is his reaction to that? He would appeal to...
Well, he tries to explain two of these away as being merely apparent. He says that the initial low entropy condition of the universe can be explained through inflationary scenarios of the universe. But as Roger Penrose of Oxford University has said, this is simply not accurate. The second law of thermodynamics would require that in any single universe, the entropy state of the universe prior to inflation will be lower than it is after inflation. And therefore, you haven't explained away the initial low entropy condition. Now, if you try to get around that by having a multiverse hypothesis, then you're going to have the problem that I raised in the debate with the so-called Boltzmann brains. That is to say, you can have observable universes which are not fine-tuned for intelligent interactive life by having these brains that just pop into being through thermal fluctuations in the vacuum and observe the illusory universe around them. And in order to try to explain away the fine-tuning of the universe, he would have to show that these observable universes by Boltzmann brains are not a significant proportion of the observable worlds in the multiverse. And there's simply no way he can do that, because these things, on any standard measure of probability, are vastly more probable than fine-tuned universes. So he could not show that observable universes have to be fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent interactive agents, rather than just observable universes that have these Boltzmann brains in them. And he simply never responded to that, either in the debate or in the post-debate comments.
What about the cosmological constant that you brought up?
Yes. What he says here is that the cosmological constant, which is responsible for the acceleration of the expansion of the universe, could be decreased right down to zero without detriment to life. And that's true. That's correct. But as he himself admits, it cannot be very much increased without disaster, because then the universe would accelerate so rapidly that galaxies and stars and planets would never form, and you would have no sites on which life could evolve. So the cosmological constant exhibits what Robin Collins calls one-sided fine-tuning. That is to say, it can't be varied much in one direction, even though it could be decreased in the other direction. And when you take the range of life-permitting values of the cosmological constant and you compare it to the range of possible values, it's infinitesimally small, Kevin, so that it most definitely is one of the most powerful evidences of fine-tuning that there is in the cosmos.
So he seems to deny all these amazing fine-tuning constants and
Yeah, that's a little bit surprising, because I think that the majority of physicists would say that the fine-tuning is here to stay, and that any attempt to craft a higher theory that would explain certain values of these constants or quantities will itself involve fine-tuning of other constants or quantities, so that whatever the final theory is, it's going to exhibit this kind of fine-tuning.
We're still going to have to fight the anthropic principle, I guess, is going to come up. And it seems to come up here a little bit. I mean,
yes,
aren't Boltzmann brains the observers that would come in and they would say, well, if there would be no one here to observe it, then, we're only reporting what we observe and so on.
Yeah, and that's his final gambit. I mean, he tries to deny the reality of fine-tuning, but when push comes to shove, he'll appeal to the many worlds hypothesis and the fact that you can only observe a universe that is fine-tuned for your existence. And the problem is that's just demonstrably false, as you said, because you could have a world that is observable by Boltzmann brains, and there wouldn't be fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent interactive life. And so he really hasn't been able to show that observable universes have to be fine-tuned for the existence of these interactive agents in the way that it is.
That'd be a good name for a rock group, Boltzmann brains, don't you think?
Yeah.
Well, there's another thing that he said against fine-tuning for life. He says, we have no idea if other values would allow other non-human-like intelligent life forms to evolve.
Yeah, and I think that that's just a misunderstanding or a failure to appreciate the truly disastrous effects if these constants and quantities weren't fine-tuned. For example, the cosmological constant, as I said, if it were much increased, the universe would just fly apart so that there would never even be planets on which any sort of life forms could evolve. In many cases, there wouldn't even be matter. There wouldn't even be chemistry, Kevin. So I think he simply is failing to appreciate the truly, truly disastrous effects that would result in the absence of the fine-tuning of these constants and quantities.
I'm curious if certain people are, perhaps Dr. Krauss as well, is saying in this that there could be life forms that were not made of carbon atoms, such as we were, and they may end up being intelligent or things like that.
That has been suggested that maybe silicon could be used, but again, biologists and physicists who have examined the properties of carbon compared to silicon have shown that silicon would not enable an organism to be a functioning, reproducing organism, so that silicon-based life would in fact be impossible.
Well, even if it were possible, if there were no planets and no matter,
right. If there's not even any elements for chemistry, it wouldn't matter.
Again, the many worlds hypothesis, that seems to be the going thing right now to try to get around God, if you want to just get down to brass tacks, in that if there are many universes, odds are we would certainly expect to find ourselves only in those in which we can live. And so the odds are in favor of us being here.
Right, and that is the chief alternative today to theism. This is where the debate lies, is many worlds versus theism. And the problem or the challenge for these many world theorists is they've got to answer the problem of these Boltzmann observers, because it is simply false that only fine-tuned universes can have observers in them, which is what Dr. Krauss is claiming or assuming here.
You call some of these many world hypotheses bloated ontologies that just require really preposterous scenarios and multiple verses and universes that look like a loaf of bread. And
it's a lot to ask for in order to avoid a cosmic designer, isn't it?
Yeah,
and especially
come on.
if you have other independent arguments for a cosmic creator, then why go to these extravagant metaphysical lengths to avoid the existence of such a being?
There's some other things that Krauss has written after the debate. And Bill, next time we want to pick up on that. Your responses to some of the things that he has said, we'll do that on the next podcast from Reasonable Faith. Thank you for being here. We're continuing to talk about the Lawrence Krauss debate with Dr. Craig. Welcome to Reasonable Faith. I'm Kevin Harris, in studio with Dr. Craig. I promise we'll get to the Sam Harris debate. But, Bill, there's been so much going on, it's difficult for us to get everything covered. We're still talking about the aftermath of the Krauss debate, and we'll get into the Sam Harris debate very soon. Two very significant debates. You knew these were important. What do you think about the level of chatter and talk and noise and fury after them?
Well, it was exciting to see. I love it when this stimulates conversation on the internet and YouTube. I think it's just great. That's one of the reasons that I like these debate forums, is because it makes God or Christ an issue of discussion, and I think that's very positive.
The next thing that Dr. Krauss wrote about after the debate, and another one of your contentions in the debate, were objective moral values and duties. And Dr. Krauss apparently takes your divine command theory, as he says, to be a sort of voluntarism. Now, what do we mean by that?
Well, what I was arguing in the debate, Kevin, is that given the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world, it makes the existence of God more probable than it would have been in their absence. In the absence of objective moral values and duties, God's existence wouldn't be as probable as they are in a world characterized by objective moral values and duties. And that seems to me to be eminently plausible to think. And what Dr. Krauss seemed to want to say is that my moral theory is that God arbitrarily makes up what moral values and duties there are, and he could have chosen an entirely different set of moral values and duties. And that seems crazy. Well, I agree that seems crazy, and that's not my view. My view is that objective moral values are grounded in the being of God himself, that God himself is what Plato called the good. He is the paradigm of moral value and goodness, and that nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commandments, like you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you shall not steal, you shall not murder, and so forth. And that these commandments then constitute our moral duties. So our moral duties are rooted in the divine commandments, and the divine commandments are rooted in God's essential character. And that's not voluntarism. That is to say, it's not to say that God just makes up what values and duties there are. Rather, these are necessary reflections of his nature.
And as we discussed, because that logically would imply that he could determine that rape was good or hate was a virtue or something like that.
Yes, and that's the
arbitrary
caricature that many people put out of divine command theory, which is, I think, very unfortunate because it's not what divine command theorists typically hold.
Well, Bill, this is what I wonder, though. I mean, is there only one divine command theory?
No, actually, there are a variety, and some of them are permutations on this idea. For example, there's one that is called the divine will theory, which would say that our moral duties are not constituted by God's commands, but by God's will. Well, I see these as sort of in-house debates among theists that are refinements of the basic view and needn't be an issue when you're talking to someone who is a secularist.
Well, this is going to come up in the Sam Harris debate, and we'll discuss that. But he kept referring to the divine command theory as if there were only one, and then attributing it to you. I mean, Bill, there are certain divine command theories that fall on the hard rock of Euthyphro's dilemma. Don't you think that a divine command theory, if it's to go through, has to get past the Euthyphro?
Yes, and I suppose a voluntaristic version would run into that problem. In fact, I guess voluntarism would simply affirm that God arbitrarily chooses what is good and what is evil and determines it himself. And although there have been divine command theorists who are voluntarists, that's hardly been the majority position. That's been an outlier position.
Go back and listen to some of our past podcasts, and Dr. Craig, people can look at your material on what the Euthyphro dilemma is. But I tell you, it seems to really serve as a corrective for an inefficient divine command theory. Another thing that he said was that, why not just bypass God? Just dispense with God. You don't need God for moral values and duties. But the argument was that you do.
Exactly. The whole argument is that in the absence of God, on naturalism, there just doesn't seem to remain any basis for the affirmation of objective moral values and objective moral duties. On a naturalistic view of the world, moral values and duties would seem to be just spin-offs of the sociobiological evolutionary process, and therefore are relative and subjective. So I simply don't see any basis on naturalism for affirming the objectivity of moral values and duties. And in fact, Dr. Krauss himself seems to admit this insofar as he embraces a kind of scientism that doesn't make room for ethical knowledge or ethical truth because it's not scientifically establishable.
He seems to be bringing up both horns of Euthyphro's dilemma. And one, a divine command theory is arbitrary. That's not acceptable to the Christian theist. On the other, God himself is subject to moral values and duties. He recognizes them and then passes them down to us.
Yes, although in this case, he seems to, I suppose you're right, Kevin, that perhaps is what he's saying, though then he would have to give us an account. He needs to give us a moral theory as to how the objectivity of moral values and duties can be affirmed on naturalism. This is what Sam Harris tries to do, but I'm not sure that Krauss really believes that objective moral values and duties exist on naturalism. I think he himself is undecided on that. He, in the debate, seemed to express a kind of undecidedness or indecision about whether he thinks there really are objective moral values and duties.
Well, he had one more complaint, and that is that different religious groups have different moral views, and so therefore there's no way they can be objective.
That's clearly a bad objection, because the existence of moral disagreement doesn't do anything to prove that one party is not right and the others are wrong. That is simply illogical to assume that because there's moral disagreement that there is no objective fact of the matter about it.
But I hear that all the time. I mean, I hear that people disagree so much on morality. How can you say that there are objective moral values?
Well, that just doesn't follow.
No, it just really doesn't.
Now, what it might mean is that it might be difficult to discern objective moral values and duties. Maybe there's a lot of gray area where it's not altogether clear what our moral duties and values are or ought to be. But you see, that is a concern of moral epistemology, not moral ontology. Moral epistemology asks, how do we discover what goods and duties there are? And I'm not addressing that question or claiming to have any special answer or insight into that question. I'm addressing the question of moral ontology. Are there objective moral values and duties? So the fact that different religions of the world, and you can throw in secularists as well here, have moral disagreements, at best says that moral epistemology is a murky enterprise, but it doesn't do anything to undermine the reality of moral values and duties.
It gets to applied ethics, doesn't it? I mean, just because people apply moral values differently doesn't mean that there are none. Exactly. We're just talking about how people apply them.
Right. Take a scientific analogy. We may not have the right theory of fundamental physics, of basic particle physics or string theory. There's disagreement in the physics community about the fundamental theory of reality. Does that mean that therefore there is no reality? That there is no way the world is? Well, obviously not. We're on a journey or a path of discovery to try to find out the way reality is. And the fact that it may be difficult to discern or murky or unclear in no way suggests that there is no objective reality about the way the world is.
Next, Dr. Krauss makes some post-debate comments on the resurrection. Now, Professor Krauss knows what it is to assign homework and to do homework himself. It just seems to me, Bill, that if you're coming into a debate here with Dr. William Lane Craig, that you at least understand some things about the resurrection and understand what you say about the resurrection, and that it's probably going to come up.
Yes, it probably is going to come up. And I think that it would be legitimate to say, I am a physicist. This is outside my area of specialization. Therefore, I'm not going to address it. I'm not qualified to speak on this. That would be acceptable, I think.
Yeah.
But it's quite another to presume then to pronounce on this area outside your discipline without having made any effort to read in that area or have some understanding of the basics of it.
Especially someone as smart as Dr. Krauss and widely read. But then he says, I mean, this nonsense that there are historians who doubt the historical existence of Jesus himself.
Yeah, he's obviously been getting this off of the internet or infidel publications or something of that sort, because that's just silly. I would like to hear the names of these historians who deny the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. The fact is that this is the province of crank history and kooks who are not professional historians. No professional historian denies the existence of Jesus of Nazareth.
Dr. Krauss says that you said that most New Testament scholars believe in the resurrection. I've never heard you say that, Bill.
No, I've not asserted that, Kevin. That's a misunderstanding. What I said was that most New Testament historians believe in those three facts concerning the fate of Jesus of Nazareth, namely the discovery of his empty tomb, the fact of the post-mortem appearances to various individuals and groups, and then the origin of the disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. That is what I said most New Testament historians agree on today. They agree that those three facts are, in fact, historical facts about what happened after Jesus died. But whether or not most New Testament scholars believe in the resurrection of Jesus, I frankly have no idea whatsoever. And I've certainly not asserted that they do.
And there are those who don't believe, but do believe those four facts.
Oh, sure. I mean, one thinks, for example, of Jewish New Testament historians like Pinchas Lapid or Geza Vermesh, who affirm the empty tomb and these appearances and so forth, but are not themselves Christians.
Dr. Krauss also commented on the willingness of the disciples to die on behalf of the truth of their proclamation that God had raised Jesus from the dead. And he says that this is not evidence for the resurrection.
Right, and I agree with that. It's not evidence for the resurrection, and he's mischaracterized my argument. He's been inattentive to the two steps in the argument, Kevin. The first step is to argue that there are certain facts that need to be explained, like the empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and origin of the disciples' belief. Step two, then, is to ask, what is the best explanation of these three facts? Now, the disciples' willingness to die for the truth of the resurrection that they proclaimed is not evidence for the second step. It's not evidence for the resurrection. That's evidence for the third fact in the first step, namely that the disciples, the original disciples, sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. And that fact cries out for some explanation. How is it that these original disciples who had accompanied Jesus during his lifetime saw him publicly crucified and killed in Jerusalem should have come to believe that something so un-Jewish and extraordinary as that God had raised him from the dead? So, of course, this isn't evidence for the resurrection. It's evidence for the origin of the disciples' belief that God raised him from the dead, which then one needs to explain along with the empty tomb and the postmortem appearances.
This also seems to be a failure to distinguish between people who die for something that they know is a lie. People don't do that, generally, as opposed to people will die for what they think to be the truth.
Yeah, this would be an argument for the sincerity of the belief of the disciples in opposition to, say, conspiracy theories, which no modern scholar would defend. No one defends today that the belief in Jesus' resurrection was a hoax or the result of some sort of conspiracy by these original disciples. They clearly believed in and were ready to die for the truth of this message they proclaimed.
Well, like Sam Harris, Dr. Krauss got tons of emails from people. You need to say this, you need to say this. This is how you respond to this. He's going to bring up this. There's a whole community, who does this out here. And I think it's called the Defeat Dr. Craig Club or something. I don't know. But so he did bring up the whole, the resurrection is borrowed from pagan myths and talk about a dead horse.
Based on scholarship, Kevin, that is 100 years or more out of date. It has been shown by New Testament scholars that pagan mythology is simply the wrong interpretive context for understanding Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus and these disciples who followed him were Jews, and it is against the Jewish context that Jesus and the Jesus movement must be understood, not pagan mythology. And so this attempt to explain the resurrection as a derivative from pagan mythology, I think, is simply based on scholarship that's over a century out of date.
A couple of more things about what Dr. Krauss has written on his comments after the debate with you. One thing on the blog that I've noticed all over the place where these remarks have been published, there have been really good Christian responses. Now, Bill, flat out, straight up, there was a time when that would be few and far between. Not anymore. There are well-versed civil Christians making good representation of Christ and are showing the flaws in these things that we hear over and over and over again. So I applaud what I'm seeing. I see very few flamers who come in and, just flame and say, well, you'll find out on the judgment day, and then God bless you, I'm praying for you and go to hell. So you're going to find a few of those, but boy, the level of response has risen, and I'm excited to see that.
I am too, Kevin. I'm so proud of our brothers and sisters who are engaging in these kinds of debates in the public square, and they do so with an intelligent and charitable demeanor. I think it's great.
Yeah, and they've obviously been listening to our podcast, so thank you very much. Now, Dr. Krauss wraps everything up by saying, quoting here, "What I hoped I could convey to the truly open-minded intellects in the audience, of which, of course, Craig was not one, was that the amazing effort to understand how the universe works reveals wonders far more remarkable than those presented by Bronze Age myths developed before we had any clear understanding of how the universe works. Simply arguing that one doesn't understand the results or doesn't like the results, and therefore one has to resort to supernatural explanations, which was the crux of Craig's rather monotonous repetition of his syllogisms, is indeed intellectually lazy, as I did say at the time." A couple of things there. He's saying that these are Bronze Age myths that you're presenting, pre-scientific, from people who had no understanding of science and how science works. If he's talking about the Bible.
He must be. That must be what he's referring to. And it simply is irrelevant to the truth of philosophical theism that I was defending, and that is defended by a good many Christian philosophers today. And he's basically reiterating the old God of the gaps charge there, which just falls to the ground since I'm not using the scientific evidence as evidence for the proposition God exists, but rather using it as evidence for a proposition like the universe began to exist, which is not a theological statement.
And the other implication is that the universe is more wonderful and remarkable than a universe that God created. You don't have to have God. Isn't it a wonderful, beautiful universe that we're exploring? God puts a big damper on that, apparently, in the minds of Lawrence Krauss and others. God's a showstopper, a conversation ender, breeds laziness because you don't have to research anymore. There's no more reason to do research, lab experiments, or field tests.
Well, that's that silly God of the gaps accusation again, which is just belied by the existence of great Christian scientists in every discipline.
Bill, are you anti-science? Have you ever been?
Oh, no, of course not. I mean, even from prior to becoming a Christian, I was an avid student of science, and that interest has continued as my philosophical careers unfolded.
But you are an opponent to scientism.
Well, that's an epistemology. That's an epistemological position that says that the only basic source of knowledge is the physical sciences. And I think that that is far too restrictive a theory of knowledge, and one that ultimately is self-defeating and would undermine science itself. So, right, I'm not a proponent of an epistemology of scientism.
So the scientist who is a follower of Christ still be motivated to find out what causes cellular mitosis, even though he believes ultimately God created everything? I mean, is he gonna say, I don't need to understand this. God did it. I don't need to understand the 30 steps involved here.
Who says that, Kevin? Who is this straw man, this caricature that's been constructed that says that? Can you think of any?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Let's get to Sam Harris and that amazing debate. We'll do that next time on Reasonable Faith. Thank you for being here.